Right. I would love to hear from your conversations around the table. If anyone would like to share who their favorite teacher is and a little bit why that was their favorite teacher or maybe the best teacher. Maybe those aren't the same, but I'd love to hear a few answers. Yeah, George, a good math teacher. I needed one of those. Still not good at math, but anyway. Any other really good teacher that you had? Anyone else like to share? Let's get two more. Yeah, more of a impactful teacher you had. More. Anybody from this side of the room want to share? That's great. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. What you didn't say is teacher's pet, right? Inflated. Yeah, cool. Well, thank you for participating in discussion around your table. I think teachers and those who are in education, they mean so much to me, and the vocation means so much to me, mostly because both of my parents come from fields in education, both have education backgrounds, and then two of my sisters are also educators as well. And so I've been around educators my whole life, and I have a great deal of respect for them. And I often, because of the field that I work in, I often see firsthand how good or bad teaching can, not that it's all the way black and white, how it affects kids specifically. And this, probably about 2 weeks ago, many of you know I had to go back to my hometown in Tennessee for a family funeral. And as we were at the wake, when people were coming through the line, it was really cool for Danielle, my wife, to see. I grew up in a really small town, and so everyone knew each other. And there's some great aspects of growing up in a small town, and there's some downsides for sure. But one of the really cool things was that as we were at the wake, I saw my kindergarten through third grade teachers just come through the line with their families and greet my family as we were grieving. And I thought it was really neat how I could remember different points in my life where teachers met me where I was at, where teachers impacted my life in such a way, or I was maybe at a really tender time in my childhood and a teacher was able to take care of me in a way they would have only been able to had they have known my family. And there was trust there because my parents knew them and maybe even knew their parents as well too. And so there was a lot of trust built there. Teachers shape and form us not only so that we can know the curriculum that's given to them, but also shape and form us for our real lives. The best teachers shape and form us for our real lives. Now, we have been in a series about values, and the value that we're going to talk about today is that Jesus leads us to apprentice him. And so, apprentice, the reason we are intentional about using the word apprentice is we could use the word disciple, right? That is just as good of a term. But the word apprentice, first of all, apprenticeship is not something you hear about often unless you're talking about trades. So, plumbing, electrician, all those different things. But the reason that we're using the word apprentice is because apprentice kind of evokes a feeling of hands-on learning, of learning from someone while doing something. And so this is the kind of way that we want to follow Jesus, is to walk and work with him and to learn from him as our teacher. And Jesus was a absolute master teacher. And I think growing up in the evangelical church, one of the things that I noticed is that there was a reluctance to talk about Jesus as a teacher at times. And the reason I think that there was a reluctance to do this is because people didn't want to see Jesus as just a good teacher. Because that is not only what he is, but I think that this may have been an overcorrection because not only does it remove some of the Jewish context of Jesus being a rabbi, but also we miss out on the genius of Jesus when we don't see him as a teacher. And then also the Christian life becomes specifically about where we're going when we die and not about who we are becoming as we live. And so there's also within that, when we think of Jesus as a teacher, it makes him human, right? It makes him human. And Jesus has to be human so that we can relate to him. But his divinity is what gives his teaching authority, gives us the ability for him to be authoritative in our lives. And so, as Jesus leads us to apprentice him, this is kind of from our values document that we've been talking about. This is a list of the different things that we see, the different things we see in Jesus' life that shaped who he was, that shaped the way he lived, and that can also shape the way we live as well. And so, we're not going to go over every single one of those today because that would take a lot of time and a lot of time that we don't have. But that's just a list that we can refer back to and look at. You can see some of it's kind of down the line a little bit. But anyway, we will, that's just kind of a list you can refer back to and that we will double click later on in the series. Talked about how Jesus is a teacher. Now, what distinguishes Jesus as a teacher? What makes him unique and different compared to other teachers, not only of his day, but of today? There's so many different options. I think the conviction about Jesus leading us to apprentice him is primarily about spiritual formation. The idea that you are constantly being formed and shaped by someone or something in your life. And so this conviction leads us to think about how Jesus is a qualified and authoritative teacher for our lives. And so the first is that Jesus is a teacher for everyone. Now, I've heard this verse a lot, and often I have focused on the last part of the verse. But I love right here that Jesus gives an invitation. He said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." And so, again, I said, I've seen the latter side of the verse and often emphasize that, but forgotten that Jesus says whoever or anyone, that he is giving an invitation for anyone to follow him. Now, teachers in that day, rabbis is what they were called, they were often really high praised men in society. And if you wanted to be a student of a rabbi, you went and sought them out. And they probably didn't have resumes back then, but you had to prove that you were worthy of being a rabbi's student. And often you would seek them out. But the difference in Jesus as a rabbi is he didn't go after the super qualified or educated Ivy League types. Jesus went out into the world and gave everyday people an invitation to follow him. In fact, he sought them out. He sought out fishermen, and he makes the invitation personal to them. He says, "I'll make you fishers of men." He sought out everyday people. He sought out a tax collector among the most hated in that society at the time. And even, when we talk about really educated people, women were not educated in that day. And there's much proof that women funded Jesus' everyday ministry. And so Jesus saw dignity and value in the people that the society of that day had marginalized and considered unimportant. Jesus called these people to follow and to come under his easy yoke. And as you can imagine, sometimes I think when we hear the word inclusive or the idea of being inclusive, we think that that makes everyone just love you all the time. But that wasn't exactly the case for Jesus. Who Jesus included in his ministry, the kind of teacher that he was, ticked a lot of people off. And it was very polarizing to a lot of people. But the thing is they couldn't say he wasn't a good teacher. Often the people who didn't like Jesus were people who engaged with him because they saw that he was such a good teacher and they wanted to stump him. Okay. So the next reason that I believe that I'll talk about this first, actually. There aren't any prerequisites in order to follow Jesus. So a lot of times when a student would come to a rabbi, they would come with their resume, so to speak. They would come with a long list of accomplishments and things and say, "Hey, here's why I'm worthy to be your student." But Jesus didn't do that. There was no proving themselves to the people he called to follow him. He just said, "Hey, I want you to follow me. come and see what this kind of life looks like and follow me where I go. And I find that to be really beautiful and compelling that Jesus was a teacher for everyone. One second, sorry. Okay, there we go. The next one is that Jesus is a teacher for our real lives. And I've found that sometimes one of the views of Christianity that I've seen before is, I don't know if you've ever seen this, but I think there's a Christian subculture that's gotten really good at cheesy acronyms. And one of the ones that I saw growing up was Bible, but B.I.B.L.E, and dot if you want another dot after there. And the saying was basic instructions before leaving Earth, which I find incredibly insufficient and not compelling at all, because I want Jesus as a teacher to have some teaching that applies to my everyday life and is not just an escape from reality as I know it right now, but is a different way to handle reality, is a different way to come to terms with reality. Because if it's just about where we're going when we die, then not a whole lot of this matters. But it's about who we are becoming as we live. It's not an escape from reality, but a different way of relating to life. Now, there's plenty of teachers that you've had that give you skills that you will no longer use, right? I'm sure that for anybody who really loves math in here, I don't use math every day. Not the kind of math you're probably thinking. I'm thinking of like algebra. I don't use complicated algebra every day. But I have a calculator app, so I'm young enough to do that. But at the same time, the best kind of teachers gave you and equipped you for your real lives, for things that you need to use every single day. And Jesus' teaching is sufficient to equip us for our real lives. It's sufficient for every single day. Even when we see Jesus and his disciples, they're asking him questions. And before the Lord's Prayer that we pray a lot, the simple statement that's made is, "Hey, Lord," or teacher or rabbi, "teach us to pray." There was a very practical application for the everyday life. One of the more explicit invitations that Jesus gave to follow him comes from the scripture that Daniel read earlier. And it's one that we've probably heard often, but he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened." And I think when Jesus gives that invitation, he's not giving an invitation. Maybe you could read it as an invitation specifically for the weary and burdened, but I think that he's assuming that life has made you weary and burdened. Now, for all of the optimists in the room, that's just a hard truth, that life can make us weary, that life can make us burdened. And so he's giving us a different set of tools to carry our everyday life, to live our everyday life, and to learn under him. Again, even people who didn't like Jesus wanted to hear his teaching because they knew it mattered and they knew that they could try and stump him. Jesus also gives another, you won't see all of it, but right after the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gives kind of the parable of the wise and foolish builders. And one is on the rock, one is on the sand. And he says, "Whoever hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on a rock." And it talks about the rain beating down and all of these different elements coming to destroy that house, but it stands firm because it is built on a good foundation. And so in both circumstances, the house that's built on the sand and built on the rock, there are things coming to destroy them. But when the foundation was one on the rock, on Jesus' teaching, on putting into practice what he was saying, it was able to withstand that mess. It was able to withstand the storm that comes in our real life every single day that we deal with. And so Jesus' teaching is sufficient for our real lives. It's not an escape from reality, but a different set of tools in order to deal with our real lives. Very last one. Sorry, one second. I got these out of order. But Jesus is a teacher who transforms. So when we think of Jesus, the only way that we can really change is through practice. You may have heard a lot of people talk about the Christian life as one that is not characterized by behavior modification. And a lot of times I know what people are saying when they talk about behavior modification, but the goal of the Christian life is to become more like Jesus. And that only happens through practice, through training. And that's true through everything else in our life. If we want to become more generous, the only way to become more generous is to practice generosity. You're not going to suddenly wake up one day and become a more generous person. That's not how it works. And it's not true for anything else like that in our lives. If we want to become people of prayer, we have to start by actually doing it. It's really, really common sense here. And so Jesus gives us that invitation to learn from him and to practice his way and to learn from him. And we can only do that by trying. Now, we are not measured by how much God loves us in by our performance at all. Not at all. But I love this quote from Dallas Willard. He says, and I say this like, I feel like I say this almost every time I preach, but he says, grace is not opposed to effort, it's opposed to earning. Not opposed to effort, but opposed to earning. So it's about the internal motivation behind why we are doing these different things. And the goal is not the practices themselves, the goal is to become more like Jesus. So the goal is not to just have a super good Sabbath day and to rest and have a really great meal. All those things are great, but that is not the end goal. The end goal is to become more like Jesus, to become more like a person who is able to rest, a person who is generous, to become a person who serves, to become a person of love. That is the end goal of the Christian life, and that is what this is all about. One thing that I think often spiritual formation starts with and ends with is desire. Simply desire is a lot of times Jesus, notice when he gave the invitation for anyone to follow him, he says, whoever wants. Want is a desire. It's not merely about facts. Maybe we've had teachers who deal primarily in facts, but I love that Jesus, he talked about desire. And as I was kind of just lying in bed last night trying to fall asleep, one of the things that just kind of came over me and that I remembered is an encounter that Jesus had with a blind man. And he asked him, "What do you want me to do for you?" He was very obviously blind because I mean, yeah, but Jesus simply asked him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And I think in between the life that we really ache for, the kind of life that Jesus is offering us, and the life that we're currently living right now, is that invitation that Jesus gives us of what do you want me to do for you? Do you want your life to be different? And in what way do you want your life to be different? And in between that, I think, comes practicing his way and apprenticing under him and learning from him. Our lives are not going to become more like Jesus by mistake. It's not going to happen by mistake. It's not going to happen by accident. It's only going to happen through taking him seriously as a teacher. The best kind of teachers not only are able to get through to many different types of students, are not only able to have teaching that is really applicable for our everyday lives, but they are also able to speak to and from a place of desire. And so I want you to consider today, as we kind of talk about the teaching around our tables, simply what do you want Jesus to do for you? If you want to learn from him, if you want your life to be different, as it is, as it stands right now, what do you want him to do for you? So let's take some time to discuss around our tables and then we'll move forward in our time together.